The military courtroom smelled of floor wax and old grievances. It was a sterile rectangle of justice carved into the basement of the brigade's administrative headquarters, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed like novice men and cast everything in a pallor that made the living look halfway to dead. 3 ceiling fans turned slowly overhead despite the February cold outside, as if the building itself hadn't been told the season had changed. Rachel sat in the gallery in her dress uniform, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who had spent 13 hours not moving on a frozen ridge and found that discipline now lived permanently in her spine. She had not wanted to come. She had told Captain Brennan that twice. He had told her once, quietly, in the way men who've survived enough wars learn to speak, that her presence mattered whether she wanted it to or not. First Lieutenant Graham Bourdain sat at the defense table in a uniform that was immaculate in a way that felt calculated. His posture was erect. His face was composed into an expression that Rachel recognized immediately, not because she'd seen it on him before, but because she'd seen it on 100 men who shared his particular variety of certainty. It was the face of a man who believed that the rules of consequence applied to everyone except himself. The judge advocate general assigned to the case was a major named Eleanor Hatch, a compact woman of 50 with close-cropped silver hair and eyes the color of winter river water. She ran her courtroom the way Rachel ran her rifle maintenance, with precision, without sentiment, and with a thorough understanding that carelessness cost lives. The charges were read: sabotage of military equipment during wartime operations, conduct unbecoming an officer, willful endangerment of a fellow soldier. 3 counts that, stacked together, could mean the end of Bourdain's career and the beginning of a prison sentence. His defense attorney, a young captain named Whitfield who looked like he graduated law school within the past 6 months, argued that the maintenance log entry had been procedurally legitimate, that Bourdain had performed an inspection as he was entitled to, that no direct evidence linked him to the physical damage to Corporal Voss's weapon. Private Marcus Webb took the stand first. He was nervous in the way young soldiers get when placed under institutional scrutiny. His hands kept migrating toward his lap before he remembered to keep them still. But his memory was precise. He'd found the log entry, cross-referenced the timestamp, confirmed the Army access codes. He described it with the flat accuracy of someone recounting something they'd rather forget but couldn't allow themselves to. Sergeant Kyle Jenkins followed. He was not nervous. Jenkins had testified before military boards 3 times in his 20-year career, twice regarding enemy engagements and once regarding a fragging incident in a previous deployment that nobody talked about in polite company. He answered questions in clipped, precise sentences, and when Whitfield tried to suggest that the weapons damage could have resulted from normal field wear, Jenkins looked at the young lawyer with an expression of professional contempt so refined it could have been classified as a precision instrument. "I've maintained sniper rifles for 2 decades, Jenkins said. Normal wear doesn't score the crown in a pattern. It takes an implement. It takes intention. What was done to that weapon was done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted it to look like something else. And you're certain the weapon was in perfect condition before the alleged tampering?" "I inspected it myself 6 days prior." "Yes, I'm certain." Rachel was called to testify. She walked to the stand and settled into it with the same economy of motion she brought to everything. Major Hatch asked her to describe her discovery of the tampering and to walk the court through her repairs. She did. She was precise and comprehensive and entirely without drama. She described the scored crown, the re-zeroing of the scope, the improvised compound she'd mixed from melted brass casings and steel shavings to reinforce the mount. She described working through the night on fingers gone numb from cold, and testing and retesting each component, and finally assembling a weapon that had no right to function at the tolerances she demanded of it. Someone in the gallery made a small sound. She didn't look up to find out who. Whitfield rose for cross-examination. He was cautious with her in the way young men sometimes are with women who've done things they cannot imagine doing themselves. "Corporal Voss," he said, "you've described extensive field repairs to your weapon the night before a major operation. Is it possible that the damage you found was a result of something you yourself had done during cleaning or maintenance, and that you simply failed to notice it earlier?" The courtroom went very quiet. Rachel looked at Whitfield, not with anger, not with contempt, simply with the clear, gray attention she brought to anything that required an accurate assessment. "No," she said. "You're certain?" "I disassemble and reassemble that rifle 200 times before combat operations. I know every surface of every component." The scoring on the crown was new. The zero drift was recent. And I had personally checked both the day before, in the afternoon, after Sergeant Patterson cleared the armory. "But you can't prove." "I can prove what I know. What I know is what I told you." She paused. "I also know that on the night in question, First Lieutenant Bourdain approached me in my quarters and told me that equipment failure could happen to anyone. He said it while looking at my rifle. I thought it was a threat. I was right." The room was very still. Whitfield sat down. The deliberation took 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on 2 of 3 counts. The third, willful endangerment, required a direct evidentiary link that the prosecution couldn't fully establish beyond the circumstantial. Bourdain was stripped of his commission, sentenced to 18 months in a military correctional facility, and discharged dishonorably upon release. When the verdict was announced, Rachel felt nothing particular. She had expected something, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction she might feel guilty about later. There was neither. There was only the same flat steadiness that had carried her through the night on the ridge, the same understanding that had settled into her bones somewhere around the 140th target. Outcomes were not the point. Actions were. You did the right thing because it was the right thing, and the consequences arranged themselves around that fact according to their own logic. Justice had been done. She had done her job. These were not connected except in the most abstract sense. She stood, straightened her uniform jacket, and walked out into the corridor before the room had finished exhaling. Brennan caught up with her outside. "How do you feel?" "Same as before." He studied her. "You know, most people would feel something. Most people weren't on the ridge." She looked at him steadily. "I used up everything I had up there, Captain. I don't have leftover feelings for Graham Bourdain." Brennan nodded slowly. He understood this in the way veterans understand things that can't be explained to anyone else. Not because the experience is secret, but because the language for it doesn't quite exist. And the approximations are insulting to the reality. "Medal ceremony is next week," he said. "I know. You planning to show up this time?" Rachel almost smiled. "No, the medal came anyway. Distinguished Service Cross, delivered to her quarters by a corporal who looked about 15 and handed it over with the solemnity of someone handing over a religious artifact." Rachel put it in her pack, beneath her notebook and above her spare cleaning kit, and went back to her maintenance. The weeks following the battle were strange in the particular way that aftermath is always strange. Not quiet, exactly, because the war ground forward with its habitual indifference, but quieter in the spaces around her. Soldiers she'd never spoken to nodded when she passed. Men who'd previously studied the floor when she entered a room now made eye contact. Kroger had been transferred to another unit, a reassignment that was officially administrative but was understood by everyone to be something else. None of it made her feel less alone. She had not expected the dreams. She was not, by temperament or training, someone who assigned much weight to the contents of her sleeping mind. But the nights after Ridge 7 had a quality she hadn't encountered before. Not nightmares, precisely. Her grandfather had told her about nightmares, the specific, replayed horror of moments gone wrong, the sticky persistence of images that won't resolve. She didn't have those. What she had was arithmetic. She would wake at 3 in the morning with numbers running through her mind. 106 to 7, 12 by 8, 300 meters, 200 meters, 940 meters. The mathematics of her day on the ridge, cycling through her sleeping brain like a program that had forgotten to stop running. And behind the numbers, faces she hadn't seen clearly through her scope but her mind had invented anyway. The captain who'd crumpled first. The radio man. The battalion commander who'd fallen at 940 meters in failing light with a compensated shot from a broken rifle. She never thought of them as people while she'd been shooting. That had been the training, both formal and informal, the learned ability to transform human beings into tactical problems during the execution of a mission. It was a necessary transformation. It was also not permanent. She sat with this alone for a long time. She didn't speak of it. She didn't write it in her notebook, which was for calculations and names of the dead she was avenging, not for the particular fog of conscience that she didn't have a name for. She went about her duties. She maintained her rifle, the repaired weapon that had become something more than equipment, a relic of something survived against the odds. One evening, 6 weeks after the battle, she sought out the brigade's chaplain. Not because she was religious. She wasn't, particularly, though she'd been raised in the loose, outdoor spirituality of Montana winters and pine forests, and her grandfather's particular philosophy that the natural world was the closest thing to God that men had managed to locate. She sought out Chaplain Marcus Ellis because he was the one person in the brigade whose job description explicitly included absorbing things that had no other place to go. Ellis was a black man of 55, heavy-set, with a kind of still face that suggested either deep peace or very effective containment of something large. He'd been in the military for 30 years. He'd been a chaplain for 25. He had the particular quality of stillness that Rachel associated with her grandfather. Not passivity, but the active, deliberate calm of someone who had learned that most problems are best met without adding your own noise to them. She sat in his office for 20 minutes before she said anything. He let her. "I keep doing the math," she finally said. "What math?" "The numbers. From the ridge. I wake up at night and I'm calculating trajectories. Wind compensation. Range adjustment." She looked at her hands. "It doesn't stop. What do you think it means?" "I don't know. That's why I'm here." Ellis was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel guilty?" She considered this genuinely, the way she considered ballistic calculations. Without sentiment, without predetermined conclusion, just with the honest application of her assessment faculties. "No," she said. "I don't think so. What I did was necessary. I believe that. I would do it again." She paused. "But I think my brain is trying to process something that my discipline doesn't have a category for." "Your discipline has categories for everything that happens before the shot and during it," Ellis said. "The training is thorough on that. It's the after that nobody teaches. They tell you it's normal. It is normal. That doesn't make it simple." He leaned forward slightly. "The mathematics you keep running. What is it, do you think? Why math specifically?" Rachel thought about this. About her grandfather and his Winchester and the counting of rings on a target at 50 meters. About the way numbers had always felt cleaner than feelings. Honest in a way that language wasn't. "Because math has answers," she said. "The calculation runs and arrives at a result, and that result is either right or wrong. There's no ambiguity." She looked at the chaplain. "The other things don't resolve." "What other things?" She thought of the faces her imagination had given the men in her scope. She thought about the notebook entry she'd written before the battle, the names of the dead she'd promised to remember. And she thought, for the first time she'd allowed herself to really think it, that every name on the other side of her rifle had been someone's Tommy. Someone's sibling who'd stepped forward because someone had to stand in the gap. "The faces," she said. Ellis nodded. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't reframe or redirect or tell her that she'd had no choice, all of which were true but none of which were what she needed. He simply sat with what she'd said and let it exist in the room without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. She came back the following week. And the week after that. It wasn't therapy, exactly. It was more like maintenance of a different kind, cleaning and inspection of components that her training had never formally addressed. 18 months after Ridge 7. Rachel was assigned to run the brigade's advanced sniper qualification course. It was not the Pentagon position, or the command track, or any of the dozen offered roles that would have removed her from the proximity of what she was and what she knew how to do. It was 6 weeks of instruction in a converted warehouse at the edge of the training facility, with a roster of 12 candidates and a mandate that she could interpret broadly. She interpreted it broadly. The standard course taught the mechanics, ballistics, range estimation, concealment, target selection, communication with spotters. Rachel taught all of that. She also taught things that weren't in the manual. She taught them about the night before the shot, about maintaining a weapon that someone has sabotaged, about the difference between a weapon you know and a weapon you merely carry. She had each candidate disassemble and reassemble their assigned rifle 300 times before she let them fire a single round, because she wanted the metal to become an extension of their hands, not a tool they held. She taught them about the arithmetic of survival, not just the mathematics of windage and elevation, but the internal calculus of decision-making under pressure. When to hold, when to move, when to call for extraction versus when staying put was the only option. How to think clearly when your brain is flooded with adrenaline and your fingers have gone numb and the scope mount is failing and you have 17 rounds left and no backup. She taught them about doubt, which she described as the most important cognitive tool a sniper possesses. The person who is certain makes assumptions. The person who doubts checks everything. She did not teach them to depersonalize the enemy entirely. She taught them to set it aside during the execution of a mission and to pick it back up afterward and to have a chaplain or person or something to bring it to. She told them about Ellis and about the arithmetic that woke her up at 3 in the morning and about her grandfather's Winchester and what he'd said about the face in the scope. Several of the candidates were women. Some were not. She treated them identically in every particular that mattered and differently only where biology genuinely required it. When a male sergeant in the 3rd week made a remark that fell into a familiar category, she had him run 8 kilometers in full kit before breakfast and then required him to clean every weapon in the armory and explain to her in writing the operational relationship between equipment maintenance and unit cohesion. He submitted a thorough essay and never made the remark again. It was in the 4th week of the 2nd course that Cadet Ashley Morrison arrived. She was 19, from rural Georgia, with a junior rifle competition record that was exceptional and the kind of focused intensity that Rachel recognized across a room. She was also visibly terrified, not of the weapons or the training, of Rachel. Rachel noticed this during the first briefing and filed it away. She did not address it directly. She ran the session as she ran all sessions, precisely, completely, without softening or theater. She assigned Morrison to the standard rotation. She observed her shooting, which was technically sound with a tendency to rush the trigger pull on crosswind shots that would cost her at range. She corrected it once, in the specific, detailed manner she corrected everything, and moved on. On the 3rd day, Morrison stayed after the range session ended. She stood at the edge of the line while the others filtered out, holding her rifle in a way that suggested she'd been rehearsing something. "Captain Voss," she said. "Morrison, I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Do you ever—" Morrison stopped, recalibrated. "How do you decide whether you belong somewhere, when everyone's telling you that you don't?" Rachel set down the target she'd been reviewing. She looked at the young woman the way she looked at a scope, reading she wanted to make sure she understood. "Who's telling you that you don't?" "Nobody here. But back home, before I applied." Morrison's jaw was set in the way of someone who's been gritting their teeth for a long time and has nearly forgotten that they're doing it. "My father said the program wasn't for women. My instructors at the junior level said I'd make a good competitor, but that combat application was different. My boyfriend said—" She stopped. "Former boyfriend." Rachel was quiet for a moment. She thought about the dugout, the whispers that floated like smoke from Kroger's cigarette, the way she'd learned to let them drift past without catching them. "Can you shoot?" she asked. "Yes." "Can you solve for crosswind at 600 meters?" "Yes." "Then you belong here by the only definition that matters." Rachel picked up the target again. "The rest of it is noise. There's no additional qualifying criterion beyond the demonstrated ability to do the work. Anyone who adds other criteria is adding their own agenda to an objective standard, and agendas don't stop bullets." Morrison absorbed this. "But you faced it too. The noise." "I did. How did you deal with it?" Rachel thought about this genuinely, the way she thought about everything that deserved a genuine answer. She thought about the rifle across her knee and the barrel she'd smoothed by lantern light with her grandfather's voice in her memory. About the 11 pounds that felt weightless because she'd made it hers. "I fixed the rifle," she said. Morrison blinked. When they sabotage something, you repair it. That's the answer. Not the confrontation, not the argument, not the accumulation of evidence. You take the broken thing and you make it function better than it did before, and then you use it to do the job, and the job speaks. She met the young woman's eyes. Words are cheap. Results are expensive. Spend your effort on results. Morrison nodded. Something shifted in her posture, not relief, exactly, but a settling. The kind of thing that happens when someone has been holding weight wrong for a long time and finally finds a better grip. One more thing, Rachel said. Your trigger pull on left crosswind shots. You're rushing it. Half a breath before you squeeze. Not after. We're going to fix that tomorrow morning before the others arrive. Yes. Dismissed. Morrison made it to the door before Rachel spoke again. Morrison. I read your competition record. You were ranked second in your category at 18. She paused. You have the technical foundation. What happens after that is will. And from what I've observed, you have more than sufficient quantities. She returned to the target scoring. Don't let anyone else's arithmetic override your own data. Their calculations aren't based on accurate inputs. Morrison left. Rachel sat alone in the empty range facility for a long time. The scored paper of 400 targets spread across the table before her, and the smell of propellant in the air like a familiar presence. 3 years had passed. The rifle was behind glass. Rachel stood in the National War Museum in the slant of a February afternoon, hands clasped behind her back, looking at the weapon that shouldn't have worked and did. The repaired scope mount, partially reconstructed, showed its field modification clearly. The improvised compound, the shimmed rings, the evidence of a night's work done in cold and fear and absolute necessity. The barrel's crown bore the microscopic evidence of a sandpaper and cleaning rod, the field work that had transformed sabotage into something she could use. The placard described it clinically. The museum had been thorough. She had refused to have a photograph on the wall. She had been firm about this in the way she was firm about things that mattered, which was the same way she was firm about everything, because she had never found a reliable method of caring about things at varying intensities. The wall held photographs of those who had survived because Ridge 7 had held 167 photographs for 167 shots, though the correspondence was not clean because the shots and the survivors were not the same people. The logic was symbolic. She had accepted it. She hadn't intended to linger. She'd come for a conference on women in combat specialties, delivering a 40-minute presentation on training methodology that had been received with a mixture of admiration and discomfort that her presentations typically generated. The museum was 2 blocks from the conference center, and she'd found herself here without exactly deciding to be. She looked at the rifle for a long time. She thought about her grandfather Samuel Voss, who had come home from 3 wars with shaking hands and ghost-filled eyes and had channeled everything he couldn't say into the silent language of ballistics, the precise, honest mathematics of force and trajectory and consequence. He taught her to shoot not to make her a weapon, but to give her the thing he'd found most reliable in an unreliable world, a skill that didn't lie, a discipline that rewarded exactness and punished approximation, a practice that required you to be fully present, because the shot that happens while you're somewhere else and your mind goes somewhere else on the target. She understood now what he'd been giving her. Not the rifle, the attention. She heard footsteps behind her, unhurried and deliberate. She didn't turn. Captain Voss. She turned. The woman standing there was about 40, in civilian clothes, with a particular posture of someone who'd spent time in uniform and never entirely left it. She had sergeant's eyes, the kind that see the practical architecture of a situation immediately and without sentimentality. You don't know me, the woman said. My name is Carla Whitmore. My brother was in the supply corridor, the one behind Ridge 7. Rachel waited. He'd been there 3 days. They were surrounded. The offensive was going to cut through. And he was, Whitmore stopped. Restarted. He's at home in Ohio now. Works in a hardware store. He has 3 kids. She looked at the rifle and then back at Rachel. He doesn't talk about the war much, but he talks about Ridge 7. He says there was one person up there who just wouldn't stop. Rachel said nothing. I wanted to find you, Whitmore said. I've been trying to for 2 years. I finally got someone at the Defense Department to. She stopped herself. I just wanted to say thank you. In person. From me and from him. Rachel looked at this woman, who had traveled to a museum in February to thank a stranger for something the stranger had done for reasons that had nothing to do with being thanked. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the notebook entries she'd written in the pre-dawn hours before the ridge. The names. The promise. What's your brother's name? She asked. David. David Whitmore. Rachel nodded once. She would write it in the notebook tonight. Not in the section of names to avenge. In a different section she'd started after the war, a section with no title because she hadn't found the right word for it. The names of the ones who'd made it. The kept promises. Tell him to stay well, she said. Whitmore looked like she'd expected something more. Then she looked at Rachel's face and seemed to understand that there wasn't more, not because Rachel didn't feel it, but because she expressed everything in the economy of someone who'd learned that precision matters more than volume. I will, she said. She offered her hand. Rachel shook it. After Whitmore left, Rachel stood alone in front of the rifle again. The cadet, Morrison, was somewhere in the building. She'd seen her in the conference audience, sitting in the third row with a rifle qualification badge freshly attached to her dress uniform, taking notes in the particular way of someone who intends to use them. Morrison had finished the qualification course 6 months earlier, first in her cohort. The trigger pull issue on crosswind shots had resolved itself by week 5, replaced by something cleaner and more instinctive. Rachel had signed her recommendation for the advanced program with a single line, recommend without reservation. She has the technical foundation, the discipline, and the will. The rest is experience, and experience will come. She thought about what she'd said to Morrison that afternoon at the range. When they sabotage something, you repair it. She had been speaking about rifles. She had also been speaking about everything else. The thing about sabotage is that it reveals an assumption, the saboteur's assumption that the target is too fragile, too dependent on functioning conditions, too limited without the systems working as designed. The saboteur is operating on a theory about the other person's capacity. Bourdain had operated on a theory about Rachel's capacity, had bet his moral calculus on the proposition that a woman, without a working rifle, in the cold, under fire, would fail. He had been wrong not because the theory was poorly articulated, but because his data was bad. He did not know that she had spent 2 decades learning to treat breakdown as information, that her grandfather had taught her to read the malfunction as the message, to understand that a rifle that isn't working is telling you something specific and true, and your job is to listen carefully enough to translate it. He did not know that she had arrived at the war already understanding that the world was not designed to make it easy for her, and had brought her tools accordingly. She touched the glass once, the way she'd touched it 3 years ago in her memory of this future moment, though of course at the time it had still been a future she was writing. The rifle looked back at her through the glass. Scored crown, repaired mount, improvised compound glinting dully under the museum lights. Every imperfection visible and documented. Rebuild what they break, she had written on the wall of every classroom. Prove what they deny. Survive what they design to destroy you. She had thought, when she'd first written it, that it was a statement about resistance, about the refusal to yield. She understood now that it was a statement about something quieter and more fundamental, about the work itself, the hands-on, present tense, component-by-component labor of making something function. Not for the audience, not for the record, for the job ahead. She turned from the rifle and walked toward the exit. She had a debrief session with the conference organizers in an hour, and after that a dinner with Jenkins, who was retired now and had developed an inexplicable hobby of woodworking, and who had sent her a handmade box 6 months ago with a note that said for the notebook in his weathered, imprecise handwriting. The notebook was in her jacket pocket. It went everywhere with her. The calculations had gotten quieter over time, the 3 a.m. arithmetic less insistent, though it never entirely disappeared. Ellis had told her not to expect it to. Some instruments, he'd said, once calibrated to a particular task, don't entirely recalibrate. They retain the memory of what they were asked to do. She had found this comforting in the way that accurate things are comforting. Outside, February bit at her face. The city moved around her, civilian, purposeful, largely unaware. She walked 2 blocks to a bench near a fountain that had been turned off for the season and sat down and opened the notebook. She wrote David Whitmore's name. She wrote the date. She wrote, underneath it, in her grandfather's words made hers, promise kept. She closed the notebook and sat for a moment in the cold. Somewhere behind her, in a museum, A broken rifle waited in its glass case. Evidence of a night when everything had tried to fail and nothing had. Not because everything had worked the way it was supposed to, but because someone had been willing to do the work that working requires. She stood up. She had places to be. This story is a work of original fiction. The events, characters, and military operations depicted are entirely imaginary. The themes of resilience, gender discrimination in combat roles, and the psychological aftermath of military service reflect ongoing real-world conversations, though all characters and situations are invented.